They laughed at his useless cloth tunnel until the blizzard trapped everyone else. Elias Carter had always been a quiet man, the kind of person who walked through town without drawing much attention. He moved gently, spoke softly, and listened more than he talked. Most people liked him, but they also saw him as a bit unusual. He lived on the edge of the small mountain town in a wooden cabin he built mostly by himself. The place looked ordinary from the outside, but anyone who truly watched Elia's work could tell he had a very unique way of seeing the world. Every winter, the mountains brought heavy snow, sharp winds, and long nights. Most people simply accepted these conditions as part of life. But Elias never forgot the winter, many years ago, when he had nearly gotten stuck outside during a sudden drop in temperature. That memory stayed with him like a quiet whisper, reminding him how quickly nature could change. So when he began stitching together long sheets of cloth, thick, insulated layers he had carefully chosen, he did it with purpose. At first, the neighbors didn't think much of it. They saw him sitting outside on a wooden stool with rolls of fabric at his feet, sewing them together with slow but steady movements. Some thought he was making large covers for his tools. Others assumed he was crafting some sort of artistic project. Elias never explained it unless someone asked directly, and even then he only offered a small smile and a simple answer. Just preparing for winter. But as days turned into weeks, the shape of his project became harder to ignore. The cloth wasn't turning into blankets or covers. It was becoming long panels that he connected end to end, forming something that looked like a soft, flexible tunnel. He attached the panels to curved poles, creating a rounded shape wide enough for a person to walk through. He anchored one end to the door of his cabin and stretched the other toward his workshop, a smaller building a short distance away. To the townspeople, it looked strange. A cloth tunnel between buildings? Why would anyone need that? They passed by on their way to the market or the post office, slowing down to stare. Some pointed. Others shook their heads with amused smiles. One afternoon, while Elias was tightening the support poles, a man named Greg stopped to watch. Greg owned the town's hardware store and considered himself practical and well-grounded. With a chuckle, he called out, "Elias, what in the world are you building? A giant sock for your house?" Elias glanced up, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Just something to make winter easier," he answered politely. "A way to move between my cabin and workshop without stepping out into the cold." Greg laughed again. "Cold is part of life up here. We've survived it just fine without giant cloth tubes." Elias didn't argue. He simply nodded and continued adjusting the poles. He had learned long ago that people often laughed at new ideas, not because they were mean, but because they didn't understand them yet. But Greg wasn't the only one amused. Soon others noticed the tunnel taking shape, stretching longer each day as Elias stitched new segments. A group of teenagers passing by on their way home from school whispered and giggled, calling it Elias Worm. An elderly woman who liked to comment on everything said loudly, "He should spend less time on odd hobbies and more time doing something useful." Elias heard the remarks, of course. They floated through the cold air easily. But he didn't let them settle in his mind. He knew what he was building, and he knew why. The mountains had their own ways, and winter didn't always come softly. He was simply making sure he could keep moving between his buildings for firewood, tools, and other supplies without stepping into dangerous winds. The tunnel wasn't just fabric. It was layered with insulation that kept heat inside. Elias had reinforced the seams, added flexible wooden ribs for shape, and installed a simple lantern system so he could see clearly even on the darkest nights. To him, it was practical and smart. To everyone else, it was humorous. Several times, people approached him with playful comments. "Are you expecting a storm big enough to swallow the sky?" one man joked. "What are you going to do next, build a cloth bridge to the grocery store?" another teased. A few even patted him on the back as if he were doing something charmingly pointless. Elias didn't mind the teasing, but he did wish people would understand that he wasn't trying to be unusual. He was just trying to be prepared. If the weather ever turned suddenly, as it had in the past, he didn't want to be stuck choosing between running outside or going without the supplies he needed. Still, even with the laughter, he kept working. In quiet hours, early in the morning or late in the evening, he would run his hands along the fabric, checking for weak points. He adjusted the tension on the poles, tightened knots, and made sure everything fit together securely. He knew that if a strong wind hit, the structure needed to bend without breaking. Sometimes, while working, he remembered those winters from his childhood. He remembered watching his father push through deep snow to reach the woodshed. He remembered hearing stories of people who had caught colds or slipped on ice simply because they had to walk between buildings during bad weather. These memories made him more determined. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long blue shadows over the town, Elias stepped back to examine the nearly finished tunnel. It curved gently like a long, warm pathway, wide enough for him to move freely and tall enough not to make him crouch. The fabric glowed softly from the lanterns inside. He felt a quiet pride, not because he wanted attention, but because he wanted safety. For him, building this tunnel was an act of care, not an attempt to impress anyone, yet the comments continued. One of the local shopkeepers remarked, "There goes Elias, building something no one needs." A young couple joked, "Maybe he's planning to hide from winter completely." Even children played games pretending the tunnel was a mysterious creature living beside his cabin. But there were also a few people who watched him with curiosity rather than amusement. Mrs. Langley, a kind woman who lived down the road, once stopped by with a warm loaf of bread and asked softly, "Do you think winter will be tougher this year?" Elias shrugged gently. "I hope not," he answered, "but hope is not a plan." She didn't laugh. She simply nodded thoughtfully and went on with her day. As autumn faded into early winter, the weather reports predicted a colder season than usual. Most townspeople paid little attention. They had heard warnings before. Snowstorms were a normal part of life on the mountain. People believed they were prepared as they had always been. But Elias knew that nature could surprise even the most experienced residents. He watched the sky each morning, noticing how clouds seemed thicker, how the air felt sharper. He felt something in the wind, something that told him he was right to prepare. Finally, after weeks of steady effort, the cloth tunnel was complete. Elias walked through it from one end to the other, listening to the soft rustle of fabric as it responded to his steps. It was warm inside, steady, and safe. He could move between buildings without worrying about icy gusts or piles of snow. He stood there for a moment, taking a slow breath, satisfied with the result. Outside, he could still hear people murmuring about his strange project. Some still giggled as they walked past, shaking their heads. But he didn't feel hurt or discouraged. He felt ready. Because deep down, Elias believed something very simple. Preparation was never useless. And sometimes, the ideas that seemed strange to others were the ones that mattered most. At that moment, no one, except maybe Elias himself, had the slightest idea how important the cloth tunnel would soon become. The town continued with its daily routine, unaware that winter was waiting with a challenge far greater than they expected. While people laughed and joked, Elias kept checking his tunnel, reinforcing small details and making sure every part was strong enough. He didn't know the storm's exact shape or timing, but he sensed that something unusual was coming. And although the townspeople couldn't see it yet, the mountain had already begun whispering its warning through the cold winds and darkening skies. Elias listened. As winter slowly approached, there was a feeling in the air that many people ignored, but Elias could not. It was not something he could easily describe. It was more like a quiet change in the way the wind moved, the way the sky shifted colors, and the way the temperature dropped a little faster each day. While the townspeople continued to live their normal lives, Elias sensed that this winter might not be like the others. In early December, the mornings became colder than usual. People scraped frost off their windows with stiff hands, and children wrapped their scarves a little tighter around their necks. Most people complained about the chill but didn't think much of it. They joked about needing extra blankets or an extra cup of warm tea. But Elias watched the sky with a careful eye each morning as he stepped out onto his porch. He had learned over the years that nature often gave small hints before something big arrived. One morning, the radio announced that a large storm system was forming far away, but the news reporter spoke in a relaxed tone. "It might bring heavy snow," the reporter said lightly. Nothing unusual for our mountain communities. The townspeople heard this and went on with their routines. They trusted that everything would be the same as always, but Elias didn't feel that same confidence. Something in the reporter's voice, something in the reports he read, and something in his own memory told him there was more to the story. He had seen winters that changed quickly, catching people off guard. He had seen how wind could rise without warning, and how snow could fall faster than anyone believed possible. So while others shrugged, Elias decided to prepare more carefully. He began to reinforce the structure of his cloth tunnel even though it was already strong. He checked each wooden pole, making sure it was firmly connected. He tightened the ropes and adjusted the fabric so it would not flap too much if the wind strengthened. He added extra layers of insulation inside the tunnel to keep it warm even if temperatures dropped sharply. Every day he found something else to improve, not because he enjoyed working endlessly, but because he believed that a little more care could make a big difference later. People saw him working and shook their heads. "You're worrying too much," they said. "The storm won't be that bad." But Elias didn't argue with them. He simply smiled and said, "It's better to be ready." Some days, neighbors stopped to watch him work for a moment. They whispered to each other, wondering why he was taking everything so seriously. One man even said with a laugh, "If the storm gets too strong, maybe your tunnel can fly away like a balloon." Elias just nodded politely and kept adjusting the poles. He knew joking was harmless, but he also knew the comments came from people who had never truly faced a dangerous winter. One afternoon, he stepped inside the tunnel to test the new lantern system he had installed. The warm light filled the space, giving it a soft and welcoming glow. As he walked through it, he felt a small sense of peace. This tunnel would protect him, and maybe one day it could protect others too if needed. Beyond the edges of town, the mountains were changing. The trees stood still, their branches stiff from the cold. Snow had begun to settle on the ground, covering everything in a thin, quiet layer. The air grew sharp, the kind that made every breath feel like a reminder that winter had arrived early. Animals moved less often now, choosing to stay close to their shelters. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual. Many people didn't pay attention to these small signs, but Elias did. He noticed how the winds carried a deeper sound than before, how clouds gathered more quickly, and how the days seemed shorter than they should. These were the signs his father had taught him to look for when he was young. His father always said, "The mountain speaks before the storm arrives, you must learn how to listen." Elias had listened all his life. As the week passed, colder nights followed. Fireplaces burned longer in every home. People began buying extra food and supplies, but only enough for a normal winter storm. No one expected anything unusual. Children continued building small snowmen outside. Families continued walking through town for errands. The air was cold, yes, but life felt ordinary. Still, Elias could not shake the feeling growing inside him. Something about the weather seemed wrong, as if the storm was waiting for the right moment to reveal its true strength. One evening, he decided to check the forecast again. He turned on his small radio, the same one he had owned for years. The voice of the weather announcer sounded slightly more serious this time. "There is a possibility of a stronger snow system moving in toward the weekend," the announcer said carefully. "Residents should prepare for colder temperatures and heavier snowfall." Elias listened closely. He could tell by the tone of the announcer's voice that even the experts were unsure how strong the storm might be. It was the same tone he remembered from years earlier when a storm caught the entire region off guard. He turned off the radio and took a deep breath. His mind felt calm but alert. He walked outside and looked up at the sky. Thick clouds stretched far across the horizon, darker than before. The air tasted like snow. He rubbed his hands together not because of the cold, but because he knew he didn't have much time left to finish preparing. He began strengthening his tunnel again, even though he had already checked it many times. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, he just wanted to be sure. He walked through it as the wind pushed lightly against its fabric walls. It held steady. He added a few more support ropes, tying them tightly to stakes he drove deep into the frozen ground. He worked patiently, taking his time with each knot. While Elias worked, his neighbors continued to underestimate the coming storm. Some laughed as they passed by. "You act like winter is coming to test us," one person said jokingly. A group of teenagers waved and called out, "Don't let the tunnel eat you, Elias." Their laughter drifted through the air, but Elias didn't feel upset. He simply waved back, understanding that they did not see what he saw. A few neighbors, however, began to wonder if Elias might be right to prepare so carefully. Mrs. Langley stopped by again with a warm drink in a thermos and said gently, "You work so hard, Elias." "Do you think the storm will be very strong?" Elias took the thermos and warmed his hands around it. "I hope not," he said softly, but sometimes a storm grows quietly before it reveals itself. She nodded thoughtfully. Maybe I should buy more firewood, she murmured before walking away. People often came to Elias for help when their heaters broke or when their old fences needed fixing. They trusted his skills. Yet when it came to the weather, most still believed that they knew enough about winter to handle anything. But nights continued to grow colder. Frost covered the ground like a thin white blanket each morning, stretching across rooftops and fences. The sky stayed gray for long hours. Even the wind changed. It carried a heavy stillness as if holding its breath. One morning, a group of men at the cafe discussed the latest forecast. "Looks like a big one said, stirring his coffee lazily. Another replied, "We've seen big storms before. No need to worry." A third man laughed and added, "If Elias is ready, then we're all safe. His tunnel will guide us like a lighthouse." They meant their words playfully, but Elias overheard them as he walked by. He didn't mind. He knew they would understand soon. Days passed and the storm grew closer. Weather reports became more urgent, though still not alarming. "Expect low temperatures," one announcer warned. "Expect snowfall that may make travel difficult." But they didn't say enough, at least not in Elias' eyes. He had learned through experience that weather reports sometimes softened their predictions until the last possible moment. Elias continued checking his supplies. He made sure he had enough wood, food, blankets, and lantern oil. He stored tools in easily reachable places inside the tunnel so he could grab them quickly if needed. The tunnel was no longer just a simple project. It had become a part of his home, a safe path connecting the pieces of his life. One evening, as he walked through the tunnel, he listened to the soft hum of the wind pushing against the fabric walls. It wasn't strong yet, but it carried a heavy promise. The lanterns flickered gently, casting a warm glow over the curved cloth ceiling. Elias placed his hand on the wall and felt the cold seeping in from the outside. He knew that soon the temperature would drop even more. Standing there in the soft light, he wondered whether the townspeople would ever understand why he worked so hard. He didn't build the tunnel to be admired. He built it because he believed in being ready for the unexpected. And he believed that taking small steps today could prevent big problems tomorrow. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard the first distant rumble of the coming storm. It sounded like a soft whisper, almost gentle, but Elias knew better. It was the mountain reminding everyone that nature was always in control. The sky outside darkened even more the next morning. Snowflakes began to fall, light and gentle at first. People brushed them off their coats and laughed as they hurried to work or school. To them, it was just another snowy day, but Elias watched closely. Each snowflake seemed to fall faster than the one before. The wind carried the flakes sideways, not downward. The sky thickened with clouds that seemed to stretch endlessly. The storm had arrived quietly, but Elias knew this was only the beginning. He tightened his coat and walked into the tunnel one more time to make sure everything was secure. He checked the ropes, the poles, and the fabric. He checked the lanterns and the supplies. When he stepped outside again, he took a deep breath. The air was colder than ever, sharp enough to make his eyes water. He knew the real storm was only hours away. And while the town still believed everything was normal, Elias could feel the truth rising like a slow tide. The storm that everyone dismissed was ready to show its strength. And the cloth tunnel that everyone laughed at was about to become far more important than anyone imagined. The storm arrived in a way that felt almost unreal. It began as a gentle snowfall that seemed harmless, almost peaceful. The snowflakes drifted down softly, landing on rooftops, fences, and tree branches. Children pressed their faces to windows, enjoying the sight. Adults walked outside with calm expressions, brushing snow off their coats and laughing that the weather report had made everything sound far more dramatic than necessary. But as the hours passed, the snow changed quietly yet noticeably. The flakes grew thicker and moved faster, carried sideways by a wind that had suddenly gained strength. The sky turned a pale, heavy gray, as if even the sun had been pushed behind a curtain. The town felt smaller under that sky, more fragile, more exposed. Most people didn't notice the shift at first. They were too busy with their daily routines to see how quickly the storm was taking shape. Elias noticed immediately. On that morning, he had stepped outside to gather some extra firewood, but the wind pushed against him in a way he had not felt for years. It wasn't a normal wind. It had weight, force, and purpose. Snow began sticking to his coat faster than he could brush it off. When he looked toward the mountains, he couldn't see them at all. They were hidden behind thick white walls of swirling snow. He knew this was the moment he had been preparing for. Elias quickly carried armfuls of firewood into the tunnel and moved everything he needed closer to his cabin. Even though he already had enough supplies, he wanted to be extra certain. He made one last walk through the tunnel, testing its stability. The fabric bent slightly under the wind, but it held firmly. His added supports were doing exactly what he hoped they would. Outside, the storm began to show its true nature. The wind grew louder, whistling sharply as it rushed between houses. Snow began piling up on porches and rooftops. People stepped outside and then quickly stepped back in, surprised by the sudden intensity. A few neighbors tried to clear their steps, but the snow fell faster than they could shovel it away. By midday, the storm had grown even stronger. The wind blew so hard that it felt like it was pushing everything backward. Snow fell in thick sheets, blurring every shape into a white haze. Trees swayed under the force, bending as if trying to hold on. Cars parked outside slowly disappeared under growing heaps of snow. Doors were becoming harder to open because snow pressed against them from the outside. Inside their homes, families started to worry. Not because they thought they were in danger yet, but because they couldn't see more than a few feet outside their windows. Everything looked white. Everything sounded like rushing wind. Everything felt colder. Elias stayed calm. He lit the lanterns in his tunnel and in his cabin, creating warm, steady light. When he walked through the tunnel, he could hear the storm roaring outside, but inside the tunnel it felt safe, almost peaceful. The walls trembled lightly, but not in a frightening way, more like a reminder of how strong the storm had become. He carried tools, blankets, and other items back and forth, using the tunnel exactly the way he had intended. He felt grateful that he didn't have to walk outside through the snow and wind. Even a short trip would have been difficult, maybe impossible. By late afternoon, the storm reached a point where no one in town dared step outside anymore. Windows rattled under the pressure of the wind. Snow pushed against walls, growing heavier and thicker. People tried to look out their windows, but all they saw was moving white. The world beyond their homes had disappeared. Inside, families began checking their heaters and fireplaces more often. Some discovered that their chimneys were partly blocked by snow. Others noticed the temperature dropping steadily inside their homes. Batteries began to drain quickly as people used flashlights more often. Some families realized that they were running low on firewood because they had planned for a normal winter storm, not something this strong. A few people attempted to open their doors to collect more wood, but the snow outside was piled so high that the door barely moved. It was as if the storm had sealed them inside. Even pushing with all their strength made no difference. The snow was too heavy. Fear began to creep into the hearts of many, but they didn't want to admit it. They told themselves that the storm would pass soon, that everything would be fine. But as the hours dragged on, the wind only grew louder and the snow only grew deeper. There was no sign that the storm would slow down. In the evening, the lights in several homes flickered. Then slowly the electricity went out in large parts of the town. People gasped, children cried, and parents lit candles or turned on battery lamps, trying to stay calm despite the growing darkness. The temperature inside those homes dropped even faster now. Without electricity, heaters were useless. Without clear paths outside, no one could gather more firewood. A sense of helplessness began to settle over the town. While all of this happened, Elias continued moving safely through his cloth tunnel. The lanterns glowed warmly against the fabric walls. He retrieved firewood from his workshop and carried it into his cabin. He made warm drinks, layered his blankets, and checked his supplies. He felt a mixture of relief and sadness, relief that he was prepared and sadness because he knew others were not. At one point, he stepped into the tunnel and listened carefully. Through the howling wind, he thought he heard something faint, a noise that didn't match the storm. He waited, heart steady but alert. Then he heard it again, a soft tapping. It was coming from a nearby house. Someone was knocking on a window, trying to get his attention. Elias walked to the end of the tunnel and lifted a flap slightly to peek outside. Snow blew into his face immediately, but he saw a dim light through the storm. It was his neighbor standing by her window and waving. She looked frightened. She held a lantern in her hand and her breath fogged the glass. He knew what had happened. She was stuck. Everyone else would be stuck too. The storm continued to rage through the night. The wind sounded like rolling waves crashing against the houses. Snow pressed against walls so heavily that some windows couldn't even open. Families huddled together under blankets, hoping morning would bring relief. But morning brought no change. The storm was even stronger. Elias stepped out into the tunnel again, listening to the storm with steady eyes. He realized the truth clearly now. No one in the town could go outside safely. No one could reach their sheds, wood piles, or neighbors. No one could even open their doors without the snow caving in. He walked to the far end of his tunnel again and lifted the flap just enough to look out. The snow outside was piled higher than his chest. The wind made it impossible to see more than a few steps ahead, but through the white blur he saw movement, small flashes of light. Other neighbors were signaling at their windows now. They were cold. They were running low on supplies. They were frightened. And they were beginning to understand. The storm was not a normal storm. It was something far stronger, something that had caught everyone off guard. Everyone except Elias. His cloth tunnel, once a joke, was now the only safe path in the entire town. He closed the flap and stood inside the warm glow of the lantern light. His heart felt a pull, a quiet but strong calling. He knew what he needed to do next, even though the storm outside was unlike anything he had ever seen. He would not stay safe while his neighbors suffered. He would help them. He would use his tunnel to do what no one else could do, move through the storm without being exposed to it. He rolled up his sleeves, tightened the lanterns, and began preparing for something he had never expected. Becoming the only person in town who could still move, still reach others, and still bring safety where it was desperately needed. The storm roared louder, shaking the world outside, but Elias did not tremble. The cloth tunnel stood firm. And he was ready. The storm continued through the night and into the next day with the same powerful force, showing no signs of stopping. Snow piled higher and higher, covering fences, cars, and entire walkways. The wind kept blowing so strongly that even the sound of it felt heavy, as if the whole world was wrapped in one long, trembling note. Inside their homes, the people of the town were beginning to understand that they were trapped. They could not open their doors. They could not walk outside. They could not reach their sheds or their wood piles. Some homes were running low on heat, and some families were already huddling together beneath every blanket they owned. As morning light slowly spread across the sky, though barely visible through the thick white haze, Elias stepped into his cloth tunnel once again. The warm glow from the lanterns followed him as he moved, making soft shadows dance across the fabric walls. Even in the middle of the storm, the tunnel felt calm, steady, and almost comforting. It reminded him why he had worked so many long hours building it. It wasn't just a project, it was protection. Elias paused at the end of the tunnel where he had seen his neighbors signaling from their windows. He lifted the outer flap just a little, enough to peek through without letting too much cold in. The wind pushed against the opening like a giant hand, but the tunnel held strong. Through the blowing snow, he saw faint lights again, neighbors waving lanterns or flashlights from their windows. Their movements were slow and tired. Some people tapped on the glass to get his attention, while others simply pressed their hands against their windows, hoping he would see. Elias felt a deep pull in his heart. He could not ignore them. He stepped back inside the tunnel and closed the flap. He took a moment to breathe, leaning gently against one of the wooden support poles. The air inside the tunnel was warm, but he could feel the cold pressing hard against the outside walls. He knew what he had to do next, even though it would not be easy. But he also knew that he was the only one who could do it. No one else could move between buildings. No one else could reach the people who needed help. No one else had a safe path. He went to his workshop and gathered supplies. He placed blankets, small tools, extra lanterns, and some spare food into a backpack. He also added rope, in case he needed to extend the tunnel or tie something securely. Every movement he made was calm and careful. He wasn't rushing, but he wasn't wasting time either. Once he had everything he needed, he returned to the end of the tunnel. This time, instead of just peeking outside, he pushed the fabric wall outward and began attaching new poles to extend the tunnel toward the nearest house. Snow blew into his face, and the cold stung his skin, but he kept working. He connected each new pole, pulling the fabric over it and securing the edges tightly. The storm tried to push him back, but the tunnel grew longer with every knot he tied. Inside their homes, neighbors watched with wide eyes. Through the windows, they could see the cloth structure stretching slowly toward them. For a moment, many of them felt unsure of what they were seeing. Could that really be Elia's? Could someone really be working in a storm this strong? But as the tunnel grew closer, they began to realize the truth. Elias was trying to reach them. With steady hands, he extended the tunnel all the way to Mrs. Langley's window, the same woman who had once brought him warm bread and asked about the storm. She stood on the other side of the glass, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes were tired but grateful. Elias tapped gently on the window and motioned for her to open it just enough to allow the tunnel end to connect. She nodded quickly and pushed the window open a small amount. Snow tried to get inside her house, but Elias lifted the fabric and wrapped it tightly around the window frame until there was no gap left. The tunnel connected perfectly, forming a safe walkway between her home and Elias' cabin. When Mrs. Langley stepped into the tunnel, she gasped. The warm lantern light surprised her. She touched the fabric walls with trembling hands. "Elias," she whispered, "you really thought of everything." Elias simply smiled. "I just wanted everyone to be safe." He helped her walk through the tunnel to his cabin, where she could warm herself by the fire. She looked around, amazed at how carefully he had prepared. Her eyes softened with relief as she wrapped herself in one of his thick blankets. While she rested, Elias returned to the tunnel. He knew others needed help too. Without hesitation, he began extending smaller tunnel pathways toward additional houses. He moved through the storm with surprising ease because the tunnel shielded him from the worst of the wind. Every time he connected a new section of tunnel to another home, he could see the same expressions on people's faces: surprise, relief, gratitude, and a bit of disbelief. These were the same people who had once laughed at his project. The same people who had joked that his tunnel was strange and unnecessary. But now, in the middle of a storm stronger than anything they had imagined, they understood how important his idea really was. At each home he reached, Elias delivered blankets, food, and supplies. He also helped families walk safely through the tunnel to his cabin or workshop, where they could stay warm. Some families chose to stay in their homes but asked for extra wood or lantern oil. Elias provided whatever he could. He never complained, never spoke harshly, and never reminded anyone of the jokes they had made before. He simply helped. Soon, word spread around the neighborhood. Elias had built a lifeline through the storm. People began signaling to him from farther houses, tapping on windows or flashing lanterns. Elias felt tired, but he did not stop. He rested only long enough to warm his hands before heading out again. Each time he extended the tunnel, he made sure the poles were secure and the fabric was tight. The structure grew like a gentle web of warm pathways connecting the entire street. Inside the tunnel, people felt a calmness they hadn't felt since the storm began. The fabric softened the sound of the wind. The lanterns made the space bright and welcoming. Children walked through laughing softly, amazed by the strange but wonderful passageway. Parents held their children close as they moved, relieved that they could travel safely. One by one, Elias brought people to safety. He helped an elderly couple who could barely walk. He brought a young family with a newborn into his cabin, making sure they stayed warm. He delivered firewood to a house where the fireplace was still working. Everywhere he went, people thanked him with teary eyes and gentle words. At one house, a man opened his window and shook his head in awe. "Elias," he said softly, "I'm sorry we laughed at you. I never understood what you were doing, but now I see it." Elias placed a hand on the man's shoulder and said only, "It's all right, we're all learning." By late evening, the tunnel system had expanded throughout the entire block. People who were once isolated could now move from house to house through the warm fabric halls. Some came together in Elias' cabin, filling the space with quiet conversation, warm drinks, and shared blankets. Others stayed in their homes but rested easier knowing they weren't alone anymore. For the first time since the storm began, hope returned to the town. Children played gently inside the tunnel, pretending it was a magical cave. Adults talked in soft voices, grateful that they could help each other. Warm light filled the tunnel, stretching across the snow-covered yards like a glowing ribbon. And in the middle of it all, Elias kept working, checking the supports, tightening ropes, and making sure everything stayed strong through the night. Even as exhaustion settled into his body, he felt a deep sense of purpose. He knew he could rest later. For now, he was the only person who could move safely outside, and he wanted to use that ability to help as many people as possible. The storm still roared, still pushed, still tried to isolate everyone. But Elia's tunnel pushed back, not with force, but with warmth, light, and simple human kindness. The cloth tunnel, once a source of laughter and jokes, had become the town's lifeline. People no longer saw it as strange, they saw it as hope. And they no longer saw Elias as the quiet, unusual handyman from the edge of town. They saw him as the one person who had been ready when no one else was. The one person who believed in being prepared. The one person whose simple idea became something that brought an entire neighborhood together. As night fell and snow continued to pile around the houses, Elias watched the lanterns glowing inside the tunnel system. The soft light reflected off the snow, creating a peaceful scene despite the storm outside. People were safe. People were warm. People were no longer alone, and Elias knew this was just the beginning. The storm was not over yet. But now neither was hope. The storm did not fully stop until the third morning. It had arrived with great force, lasted longer than anyone expected, and left the town almost completely buried in snow. When the wind finally softened and the sky grew quiet again, the world outside looked completely different. Every roof, tree, and road sat under a thick white blanket so deep that many houses seemed shorter, as if the ground had risen to meet their windows. The town looked peaceful, but it was the kind of peace that came only after something powerful had passed. Inside Elias' cabin, the warm glow of lanterns filled the room. Several families were gathered there, some drinking warm tea, some wrapped in blankets, and others simply resting after 2 long days filled with cold, fear, and uncertainty. Elias moved gently among them, checking the fire, offering warm drinks, and making sure everyone felt safe. Even though he was tired, more tired than he had felt in years, his heart felt calm. People were safe. That was what mattered most. Slowly, the sound of the storm faded into silence. The wind that had roared for hours became nothing more than a soft breeze. The tunnel, which had once trembled quietly under the pressure of the storm, now rested peacefully. The lanterns inside it glowed warmly, lighting the path between houses like a soft golden ribbon laid gently across the snow. As morning light continued to spread, people cautiously peeked through the cloth tunnel flaps, looking out at the world beyond. The snow was piled so high that stepping outside would have been impossible without sinking into it. But compared to the storm they had survived, the stillness felt like a gift. Elias stepped into the tunnel and walked toward the end of it. The fabric walls were cold to the touch, but they were still strong. He placed his hand on one of the poles and smiled quietly. It had held up better than even he expected. Hours of hard work, careful planning, and the support he had added had made the tunnel sturdy enough to withstand the storm's full strength. He opened the flap slightly and looked outside. The sky was clear at last, a soft pale blue stretching over the mountains. The snow sparkled under the sunlight like millions of small diamonds. It was beautiful but also overwhelming. The storm had left behind a world that would take days, maybe weeks, to dig out from. Behind him, he heard children laughing softly inside the tunnel. The sound warmed his heart. 2 days earlier, the same children had been frightened, cold, and unsure of what would happen next. Now they were smiling again, touching the fabric walls, playing gentle little games as if the tunnel were a magical place. And in a way, it was. It had given them safety at a time when the outside world had been too harsh to face. Soon, more neighbors stepped into the tunnel, wearing warm coats and scarves. They wanted to see the world outside, but they also wanted to see Elias. The moment they spotted him, their faces lit up with gratitude. Some gave him warm smiles, others held his hands, some simply looked at him with quiet appreciation as if words were not enough. One man spoke first. "Elias, I have never seen anything like this. Your tunnel, it saved us." Another woman added softly, "We would not have managed without you. Thank you." Elias felt slightly embarrassed by the attention. He was not used to people praising him. He had lived a life of quiet work, often unnoticed. The tunnel was never built to impress anyone. It was simply something he believed would help him stay safe during winter. He had never imagined that it would become a lifeline for an entire neighborhood. He nodded politely and said, "I am just glad everyone is all right." His voice was gentle, but his words carried deep sincerity. A few people laughed softly, not out of humor, but out of relief. For the first time since the storm began, the air felt lighter. As the sun climbed higher, more townspeople slowly made their way through the tunnel system Elias had created. Some came to deliver thanks. Others came to help clear snow from the connected homes. Even though people could not step outside safely, the tunnel allowed them to work together. They formed small groups, sharing warm drinks and planning how they would begin digging once the snow settled enough for safe movement. Everywhere Elias looked, he saw people talking, helping one another, and moving freely through the tunnel he built, something they had once laughed at. Children skipped through it. Adults walked through it with grateful expressions. Elderly neighbors touched the fabric with gentle hands, as if amazed that something so soft could have protected them from something so strong. The tunnel had brought them together in a way that nothing else could have. It reminded them that community mattered, that helping each other mattered, and that sometimes the simplest ideas could be the most powerful. Later that afternoon, the mayor of the town, Mr. Dawkins, approached Elias. He had walked through the tunnel slowly, stopping several times to examine its structure. His eyes were thoughtful, not with judgment, but with appreciation. When he finally reached Elias, he extended his hand with a respectful smile. Elias, the town owes you more thanks than we can express. This tunnel, well, it did more than keep you safe. It kept all of us connected. It kept us warm. It kept us from panicking. You've done something remarkable. Elias shook his hand politely. I only wanted to be prepared, he said softly. I didn't expect it to become so important. But it did, the mayor said with a nod. And that matters, truly. Word spread quickly through the town about how Elias had helped everyone during the storm. People began sharing stories, how he delivered wood to homes, how he brought blankets to those who were cold, how he helped families walk safely through the tunnel to his cabin. Some even shared small moments, like how he had smiled reassuringly or how he had gently tied the tunnel fabric to their windows so they wouldn't feel scared. Each story carried the same message. Elias had been there when no one else could be. The laughter that once followed him around town had disappeared. In its place, there was respect. There was admiration, and there was gratitude that felt genuine and warm. When the storm finally cleared completely, and people were able to start digging their way back to normal life, something special happened. Instead of returning to the habits they had always known, many townspeople began asking Elias questions, curious questions, respectful questions. How did you make the tunnel walls so warm? What kind of fabric did you use? Do you think you could help me build one for my home? Could we make a bigger version for the whole neighborhood next winter? Elias listened with quiet amazement. He had never expected people to want his help with such things. But he felt a quiet joy in knowing that something he created, something others had called useless, was now inspiring new ideas. Instead of being a source of laughter, his cloth tunnel had become a model of safety and preparation. In the weeks that followed, the town slowly returned to normal, though the memory of the storm stayed strong in everyone's minds. Roads were cleared, roofs were fixed, and life began to settle again. But one thing had changed permanently, the way people saw Elias and the way they valued preparation. People no longer walked past him with amused smiles. They walked up to him with friendly greetings. They offered help with projects. They asked for advice. They invited him for warm meals. Children waved at him every time they saw him, calling him the Tunnel Hero, a nickname that made him blush but secretly warmed his heart. Elias never asked for attention, but he accepted their kindness with gratitude. He continued living simply, fixing things around town, helping neighbors, and caring for his home. But now, he was no longer the quiet man people overlooked. He was the man who had stood strong in a moment of uncertainty, the man who had built a path through a storm, the man who had shown the whole town that sometimes a different idea can become the very thing that saves everyone. As winter turned to spring and the snow began to melt, the cloth tunnel was taken down carefully, but not thrown away. People handled it with great care, folding each section neatly. They talked about improving it, expanding it, and building new tunnels before the next winter. Elias watched them work with soft, proud eyes. His simple creation had become a symbol, not just of safety, but of community, teamwork, and the power of believing in one's ideas even when others don't. And though he never said it aloud, deep in his heart he felt grateful too. Not because people finally respected him, but because he had seen his quiet efforts make a difference in a moment when it mattered most. In the end, the storm taught the entire town a lesson they would never forget. sometimes the idea that looks strange. The idea that people laugh at, the idea that seems unnecessary, is the very idea that saves the day. And the cloth tunnel that had once been a joke was now remembered as the reason so many families stayed warm, stayed calm, and stayed connected. Elias never bragged, never demanded credit, never expected anything in return. He simply continued living the only way he knew how, with quiet care, thoughtful planning, and a heart ready to help. But the people of the town remembered. And they would never laugh at his ideas again.